Welcome. I'm David Sproles, the president of the New York School of Interior Design. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Michael I. and Patricia M. Sovern Lecture on Design, the college's foremost public presentation of the year. Before I introduce tonight's guest of honor, I would like to offer a heartfelt thank you to Patricia Sovern and her late husband Michael, a respected legal scholar, mediator, teacher, and president of Columbia University. This is the first Sovern Lecture since Mike's passing, and his presence and good humor are dearly missed. Pat is Chairman Emeritus of the New York School of Interior Design's Board of Trustees, where she served for many years as a valued member. It was through a generous gift to the college that we were able to endow a lecture series in their name to bring the highest caliber speakers to our audience. For our 2021 Sovern Lecture, I am pleased to welcome the scholar Mary McLeod. Mary is a professor of architecture at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she teaches architecture history and theory. She has also taught at Harvard University, the University of Kentucky, the University of Miami, and the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. Her research and publications have focused on the history of the modern movement and on contemporary architecture theory, examining issues concerning the connections between architecture and ideology. Mary is co-editor of Architecture, Criticism, Ideology, and Architecture Reproduction, and is the editor and contributor to the book Charlotte Perriand, An Art of Living. She also initiated and helped curate the exhibition Charlotte Perriand, Interior Equipment, held at the Urban Center in New York. Her articles have appeared in countless publications, journals, and anthologies, and she has received numerous fellowships and awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship, a NEH Award, and grants from the New York Council on the Arts and the Graham Foundation. Tonight, we are lucky to have her speak about the role of women in European modern design between the world wars. Mary, I turn the screen over to you.
Before I begin, I would first like to express my appreciation to David Sproles for the invitation to give the Sovern Lecture, and to Dennis Scully and Jeremy Handelman for all their technical support. It's a tremendous honor to be giving this talk, in part because Michael Sovern was president of Columbia University shortly after I first began teaching there at Columbia over 40 years ago. He was a brilliant leader, visionary in so many ways, both in supporting architecture and women faculty. So I'm hoping that my lecture topic today will be especially appropriate. I also want to express my appreciation, my deep gratitude, admiration, and affection for Patricia Sovern. I still remember the day she asked me if she might audit one of my architecture history classes. I confess I was a bit terrified, intimidated, I should say. But fortunately, she did attend the class and we became friends. And I've been grateful to her for her friendship and support ever since. So thank you again for this wonderful invitation. In 1971, 50 years ago, Linda Nochlin wrote a brilliant and groundbreaking essay, "Why Have There Been No Great Female Artists?" Her answer, as I'm sure many of you know, was not that women lacked talent or perseverance, or any other innate capacities that might allow for the creation of great art, but rather social, economic, and institutional factors made it impossible. Motherhood, housework, social obligations, the lack of training and mobility all prevented women from having the experience, time, and concentration required for serious artistic production. Until recently, we could have readily asked the same question about women architects and would have given an almost identical response. Today, however, I would like, as my title proposes, to ask a more positive question. How did women change or help change modern architecture? More specifically, how did women change European modern architecture and design before World War II? However, in posing this question, I need to state at the onset two qualifications. First, that I won't fully answer my own question, but simply propose several areas where I think women's influence is most visible. Second, as you may have already noticed, and I realize this is especially important to note when speaking to an audience at a school of interior design, that I will frequently blur distinctions between design and architecture. This was still common in the 1920s and 30s, as it was throughout the 19th century. For example, modern architects such as Alvar Aalto and Mart Stam designed furniture. Likewise, individuals who began as furniture designers, such as Gerrit Rietveld, Pierre Chareau, or Marcel Breuer, designed buildings. In the case of women, this blurring of boundaries between the two fields is even more evident. Like many of the most renowned European women designers, architects of the period, Eileen Gray, Charlotte Perriand, Lily Reich, studied the decorative or fine arts before attempting architecture. Not surprisingly, given that many schools in Europe did not accept women until after World War I. For example, the first French woman did not graduate from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris until 1923. And it was not until the late 30s, in fact, that the first women received architectural degrees in Spain and Italy. And with these qualifications, I shall begin in earnest. For years, the coupling of women designers with modern architecture was regarded more often than not as a contradiction in terms. The revered heroes of the European modern movement were all men. And you know the names: Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and so too were most of the noted secondary players, including J.P. Oud, André Lersault, Giuseppe Torragni. The very image of the self-assured genius, breaking with conventions and academic styles, was invariably male. Much contemporary theory, even that written from a feminist perspective, has reinforced this ingrained perception of modernism as male, autonomous, pure, and austere, the privileged realm of male activities. In other words, high art is male, entertainment female. However persuasive this argument might be for literature and other cultural forms, and one could argue about that as well, it is only partially true for architecture. If the machine imagery of Le Corbusier's Vers une architecture still perpetuated the masculinist biases of modernism, other dimensions of modern architecture, including that same treatise, its emphasis on domesticity, its social agenda, and the formal challenges to traditional gender conventions, suggest a more complex story, one that I hope to show gives women a substantial role as a source of inspiration and creator. As feminist scholarship since the 1970s has shown, women were actively engaged in European architecture between the wars, despite considerable social and institutional obstacles. Here are images of some of the now better known figures: Eileen Gray, Lily Reich, and Aino Aalto, all, I might add, largely excluded in standard modern architectural histories, such as Siegfried Gideon's and Rainer Banham's. Though to be fair, in a later edition, after Aino Aalto died, Siegfried Gideon added her to his next edition. But I would also like to cite, if in passing, other important women designers whose names remain largely unfamiliar and deserve to be better known, such as Marlene Polzig, Elsa Guidoni, Helena Sirkus, Lot Cohen, Ingrid Wahlberg, and Leonie Geisendorf, And there are, of course, so many others I might mention. In contrast to some of our assumptions, women's role in modern architecture was widely acknowledged before World War II. Their designs were published, especially relative to their numbers. For example, Perrion's work appeared in magazines and newspapers such as Art et Décoration, Art et Industrie, L'Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, and The Studio, even the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, often receiving lavish praise. Eileen Gray's designs were featured in an entire issue of the Dutch avant-garde magazine Vendigen, and then again in a special issue of L'Architecture Vivante. And even women whose names have largely been forgotten, such as Adrienne Gorska and her partner Sarah Lipska, were widely praised, as in this article appearing in 1930 in the English Architecture and Building News. What is especially striking about the criticism of the period is how often it allies modern architecture with the invention and creativity of these pioneering young women. For example, Marcel Valouter writes on seeing Charlotte Perrion's 1928 Salon de Manger, "Never before have I so definitively the feeling of entering a new world, the feel of breaking with narrow traditions, of a window open to the future." Today, I would like to propose that the focus on domesticity and housing in modern architecture offered women new opportunities for participation in the profession, and that they in turn helped shape these concerns. Certainly more than their male peers, women designers were acutely aware of the need for reform. In trying to outline this contribution of women to modern architecture, I shall focus today on three areas or three scales of domestic architecture: furniture, kitchens, and housing. And in each case, I shall also focus primarily on the work of one designer. Although the sources of women's innovation vary considerably, I would like to emphasize three factors in women's experience that seem especially relevant to their contributions: decorative arts training for furniture and interior design, the domestic reform movement and household rationalization for kitchens, and women's long-standing engagement with social and charity work for housing. Furniture, interior equipment for dwelling. Although male designers, notably Marcel Breuer and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, still dominated the field of modern furniture design, women were probably more readily accepted in this area than in other arenas involving large-scale construction, since it was seen as an extension of interior decorating and women's traditional role of creating a home. Even before architecture schools began accepting women students, design schools admitted women. So much so that Le Corbusier complained in 1925 that the decorative arts in France risk foundering among, quote, young ladies. Given this comment, it is all the more surprising that he would hire one of those young ladies. A 24-year-old designer, Charlotte Perriand. Perriand had studied at the Union Centrale des Arts Décoratifs, a decorative arts school in Paris for women students, where she received, as she put it rather sarcastically, the training of an upholsterer. Here are examples of her schoolwork and her first exhibition done the year after she graduated in 26, A Corner of a Salon, a rather conventional Art Deco design. Only 1 year later, at the 1927 Salon d'Automne, she exhibited the bar in the attic with gleaming aluminum and nickel-coated surfaces, glass shelves, and brightly colored leather cushions, a witty synthesis of casual bohemianism and chic luxury. It was widely praised in the professional press. Even before the exhibition's opening, however, Perriand was no longer satisfied creating stylistic images of modernity for a bourgeois elite, and she was determined to work for Le Corbusier, who was committed to serial production and, even more important to her, the creation of low-cost housing. When she first approached him in October 1927 for a position, his response was hardly encouraging. "We don't embroider cushions in my studio." But something about the determined young woman must have captured his imagination, and a month later, he visited her stand at the Salon d'Automne, and by December, she was working in the atelier. One of her first tasks was to develop a series of furniture pieces, an assignment that resulted in the 3 tubular steel chairs for which the firm is famous: the siège à dossier basculant, chair with a swinging or tilting back, the fauteuil grand confort, easy chair, and the chaise longue. Le Corbusier proclaimed the chair a machine for sitting, but had stressed that such machines should accommodate different bodily positions necessary for different tasks. There you see his sketch and a mock-up of models by Perriand. Perriand described the creative relationship among Le Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret, his partner and cousin, and herself as being like 3 fingers on one hand. She credited Le Corbusier for setting the design parameters. She worked out with Jeanneret the designs and full-scale details, and then she took charge of the execution herself, fabricating the first prototypes in her own studio apartment. In 1932, Le Corbusier credited Perriand for having, quote, "the sole responsibility for the execution of our domestic equipment." And for years, he regularly acknowledged her role and praised that role in the firm's work. From her sketches, it's clear she had a seminal role in the chair's design. The first chair that Perriand developed for the firm was the siège à dossier basculant, which was intended for living room conversation. It was basically a reworking of the colonial or British officer's chair, with tubular steel legs replacing the wooden supports, and its arm straps now tightly sprung with metal coils. While the frame would remain standard, Perriand envisioned that the fabrics might vary depending on the setting, our client's preference, or even the season. In its separation of structure and bodily support, in its lightness and its mechanistic aesthetic, the chair also recalled Breuer's 1925 Vasily chair, but with notable differences in scale and elaboration. The dimensions of the siège à dossier basculant suggest a female occupant or a slender man, while it is easy to imagine a big executive sitting in Breuer's wider, more mannered model. In contrast, the fauteuil grand confort was to be a machine for relaxing. Squat and plush, it was a modern translation of the overstuffed easy chair that might be in a club or a gentleman's library. This innovative design, with its exposed frame, inverted the usual relationship between frame and upholstery in traditional easy chairs, while still offering the essence of luxurious comfort. The chair was made in 2 sizes, suggesting that both men and women and a wider range of bodily types could enjoy its enveloping pleasures. None of the Sachlich German or Eastern European designers had yet successfully dealt with the issue of comfort. Breuer had called the Vasily a club chair, But unlike the partner's model, it was not a chair one could curl up in. With the serpentine chaise longue, Perriand addressed another aspect of relaxation. The lounge chair permitted different reclining positions, and since its inception, it has been widely praised for its comfort. Its precedents included bentwood rocking chairs, adjustable invalid chairs, the Morris lounge chair, ocean liner deck chairs, and fundamental to the chair's sensuous quality, the earlier Duchesse or Duchesse Brisée. 18th century grace and eroticism have their 20th century equivalent in this light, undulating structure poised on 4 points, so beautifully illustrated by the classic image of Perriand relaxing on its stretched canvas surface. Paradoxically, both Perriand and Le Corbusier mentioned a man in their description of the chair's creation. Perriand explained that she thought of, quote, a simple soldier who, when he's tired, lies down on his back, puts his feet up against a tree with his knapsack under his head. The abandonment of traditional masculine or feminine chair types was, in fact, one of modern furniture's most radical breaks with precedent. As late as the spring of 1927, Le Corbusier was still distinguishing between male and female furnishings. But by 1928, after Perriand's arrival, those distinctions had disappeared. Because tubular steel combines such traditionally male and female attributes as strength and lightness, straight lines and curves, the difference between a man's chair and a woman's chair no longer seemed relevant. Modernism's elimination of figurative imagery also reduced references to gender, leaving scale, color, and setting as the primary variables in design. Although in the late 1920s, French critics had begun to question gender distinctions in furniture design, Perriand herself made no allusions to gender in her own writings about furniture. And in fact, in her rather well-known polemic called Wood or Metal, she talks about sports, automobiles, airplanes, but no references at all to gender. In fact, the man of the 20th century, but not the woman of the 20th century. However, in the context of the conservative French post-war milieu, the very rejection of clear gender stereotypes was in itself probably understood as a challenge to bourgeois conventions and women's traditional role in the home. This was all the more evident in the model apartment at the 1929 Salon d'Automne that she and Generet designed as a showcase for the new mobile furniture pieces. And Le Corbusier, in fact, was in South America at the time, so he had nothing to do with this project. They called the exhibit Equipment for a Dwelling, and it included, besides the 3 chairs, the so-called airplane table, and Perriand's own swivel tubular steel chairs, which were intended for dining. The critic Max Ternier declared it a manifesto, quote, a declaration of war on the ideal of the padded and stuffed bourgeois salon. Like the furnishings, it promised a more functional, flexible, and gracious form of domesticity that might appeal to a new woman, if one that was too expensive and extreme in its aesthetic for most middle class and working class people. In general, I would like to propose that Perriand brought a degree of sensuousness and whimsy, color and texture, as well as an attention to details of living, what I might call a more humane functionalism to Le Corbusier's interiors. Her wit is perhaps most visible in this 1931 exhibition stand, where she pieced together tourist rugs to the chagrin of the German designers who saw it in 1931 at the Berlin exhibition. Although there's not time to discuss in detail other women designers, I think many of them brought similar qualities to modern architecture, whether owing to their experience in the decorative arts, especially textiles, or their personal concerns with the activities of domestic life. Here I show Eileen Gray's wonderful living room at the Villa E1027, featuring her rugs and marvelously inventive furniture, and Lily Reich's sensuous woman's bedroom in the 1931 exhibition, Dwelling in Our Time. And it was in fact the only design by a woman that Hitchcock and Johnson included in the International Style book at MoMA. But these were far from the only women who designed furniture and interiors. Whether Ino Elto, who was usually credited for the interiors of Villa Maria and much of the furniture in Elto in her own studio house, or Flora Steiger Crawford, a talented Swiss architect and the first woman to receive an architectural degree from ETH in 1923, who designed this early stacking chair and lamp. Kitchens. There was probably no arena in which women had as much influence in modern architecture as the kitchen. For centuries, architects ignored the kitchen as a subject of design. It was considered a utilitarian space, one primarily for servants and housewives. By the late 1920s and 30s, however, this changed dramatically. Architectural exhibitions featured modeled kitchens, professional magazines published articles on kitchen designs, and architects now finally included photographs of kitchens in accounts of their work. This new focus on kitchen design was inspired by a growing domestic reform movement led by women in Europe after World War I, primarily middle-class women. Their interest had been sparked by various factors, including the pre-war women's suffrage movement, the so-called servant crisis, and the growing promotion of rationalization in industry. Following the examples of American women, such as Catherine Beecher in the 19th century, but even more important, Christine Frederick and Lillian Gilbreth in the early 20th century, these reformers actively campaigned in the 1920s and 30s to rationalize housework by applying to the organization of the home the principles of scientific management first developed by the American industrial engineer, Frederick Taylor. Housework itself, they argued, would gain new professional stature and respectability. The European domestic reform movement had its earliest and strongest impetus in Germany. In 1921, Irene Witte translated Frederick's New Housekeeping, Efficiency Studies in Home Management, which had been published in 1913, into German. And this may have inspired Benedetta Otta's early kitchen for the Bauhaus House on Horn. And I want you to notice the continuous counter that was revolutionary at the time. And it definitely influenced Bruno Taut's 1924 book, Die Neue Wohnung, The New Home, whose subtitle was Woman as Creator. Taut reproduced Frederick's diagram of efficient kitchen movement, you see the good and the bad, only translating the labels into German. And in 1926, Erna Meyer published a book bestseller called Der Neue Haushalt, The New Household, which went into some 29 editions in 2 years. Meyer's book was soon translated and was followed by numerous studies of household management in the Netherlands, France, Finland, England, and Italy, all of which devoted special attention to kitchens and often reproduced, as you see, Frederick's diagram. Frederick had insisted that kitchens be used strictly for the preparing of food or clearing it away, and proposed the grouping of related activities, continuous work surfaces at the correct height, and proper lighting and ventilation. Many of the young European women designers, including Ino Elto, Lily Reich, and Salma Satala, quickly embraced these ideas and proposed model kitchens. The most famous of these new designs was the prefabricated kitchen designed in 1926 by Marguerite, or Greta as she was better known, Lohotsky, under the auspices of Frankfurt's Municipal Building Department, headed by the architect Ernst May. One of the first fitted European kitchens, it came complete with stove, sink, and built-in cabinets. But what distinguished it most from other kitchen designs was its wide-scale production. Approximately 10,000 units were installed in 4 years in the newly built settlements in Frankfurt alone. Lohotsky's interest in kitchen design dates back to the early 1920s, when she began working with Adolf Loos in the Viennese housing office. Here she studied kitchens as part of her research on low-cost housing and proposed a concrete kitchen, which was to be factory assembled and mounted by crane. Impressed with her work on household rationalization, Ernst May, shortly after he was appointed city architect in Frankfurt in 1925, invited her to join his team. According to one anecdote, which may well be true, he asked the young but experienced designer how much money she would like to earn, and then promptly doubled the amount she specified. In Frankfurt, as in Vienna, she was deeply committed to providing functional, comfortable, and affordable housing to thousands of workers. But her ambition, like May's, was broader, to create a new Wohnkultur with health, sports, and other leisure activities available to all. Architecture, including her functional kitchen, was a means toward a fuller and more egalitarian life. Her primary goal in designing the kitchen was to reduce women's labor and ensure physical comfort. Besides warding off stress-inducing drudgery, Lohotsky considered the kitchen a step forward towards women's self-development, which, contrary to the pervasive rhetoric at the time, she placed before the family as a whole. Undoubtedly, Lohotsky viewed cooking and cleaning up as necessary chores, ones that in her time were the burden of the housewife. To assume otherwise in 1926 would have been utopian. In 1921, she had already declared, first, life is work, and second, it is relaxing company pleasures. The kitchen was for work, the more spacious living room for pleasure. Before designing the kitchen, Lohotsky did numerous studies of cooking movements and circulation patterns in order to determine the most efficient arrangement. She studied closely Witte's translation of Frederick's New Housekeeping, which she later described as her Bible. However, unlike Frederick, Lohotsky also sought to extend rationalization to construction. She conceived the kitchen as one unit that would be serially produced to reduce costs and thus make it affordable to as many as possible. Lohotsky proposed 3 models of kitchens, 2 larger ones intended to accommodate 1 or 2 servants, and 1 smaller one, Type 1, the renowned Frankfurt kitchen, which was the cheapest and most popular of the three. It's the one on the right. Depending on the housing complex and the orientation of the apartment, minor variations of the layouts were made, a flexibility made possible by the small production runs, only 13 to 15 units at a time. What was really important to her was that each facet was worked out in precise detail, as you can see from these very carefully studied elevations and sections. She kept the Type 1 galley kitchen intentionally compact, about 6 by 11 feet, so that several tasks could be completed while sitting on a pivoting stool simply by extending one hand. Thus, all the equipment for cooking preparation and cleaning up, cutting board, cold storage box, double sink, drainage board, and cooking utensils were grouped together at one end of the kitchen, near the exterior window. Although the technology was kept modest to minimize costs, Lohotsky introduced a series of practical devices, including a removable waste drawer below the cutting board for any vegetable scraps, a wooden plate rack attached to the underside of a cabinet for dishes to drip dry, and a special set of aluminum canister drawers that had pouring spouts and measuring bars for easy usage. Two notable features were an insulated cooking box, which the housewife could use for slow cooking while she worked or did other household chores, and a hanging lamp that could be moved along a metal rack depending on where the woman was working. And remember, electricity was very expensive then. There was also a fold-down ironing board. Lohotsky's aesthetic choices, the glass cabinet panes, aluminum sink and drawers, the linoleum floor and counter surface, all reinforce this image of an efficient, hygienic workspace. The most popular color choice for the wooden frames of the cabinet doors was a grayish blue, a color specifically chosen because it repelled the flies. Surprisingly, many of these so-called Type 1 kitchens are still in use and seem to still work well, if now with modern appliances and various personal touches. Public reaction to the Frankfurt kitchen was varied. Most modern architects and critics praised it, as did many housewives, for its efficiency. And in fact, it was publicized with things like film clips showing how efficient the movement sequences were. A government report on kitchen design called the Frankfurt kitchen the best solution up to that time for those without servants. It was also widely celebrated in the press and popular culture. Here's, in fact, a song written in Lohotsky's honor that was quite popular at the time. However, kitchen reformer Erna Meyer criticized it for being too rigid and too narrow for two people. Meyer's own roomier kitchen designs at the Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart in 1927, one of which she designed with Hilda Zimmermann, the other in collaboration with J.P. Oud, can be viewed as direct responses to Lohotsky's model. No matter how one views the kitchen as inadvertently regressive in reinforcing women's traditional role as housewife, or as progressive in allowing women more time for other activities, including employment, Lohotsky and Meyer's designs represented a break with gender stereotypes and traditional images of domesticity. Like the domestic reform movement in general, they helped undermine long-standing assumptions that rationality, efficiency, and modernization were male values, and inversely, that decoration, emotion, and coziness were essential qualities of women's spaces. The influence of their efforts was felt almost immediately throughout Europe. In France, for example, Paulette Bernège, a recent philosophy graduate, actively took up the campaign for domestic reform, with 2 publications in 1928, translating the titles Household Management and If Women Made Houses. The latter illustrated with delightful sketches. I don't know how she, if you could go back, please, how she came up with this, but going up and down the stairs for 40 years was like raising the Tour Eiffel, and walking back and forth to the dining room over the same length of time was like walking from Paris to Lake Baikal. Kitchen design was again a major concern for her, and you can see her efforts to try to accommodate the strange forms that resulted from Haussmannian apartment blocks. Bernège was in close contact with Le Corbusier, and he arranged for her to be invited to the CM, International Congress of Modern Architecture at Frankfurt, in 1929. Not surprisingly, Perriand herself gave special attention to the kitchen in the model apartment she designed at the Salon d'Automne, with its reflective surfaces, chrome fittings, electric fan, built-in refrigerator, and modular metal and glass storage units. It looks much more sophisticated and seductive than Lahotsky's more modest model with wooden cabinets. Undoubtedly, it was much more expensive too. For the first time, Le Corbusier began publishing photographs of the kitchens in his white villas, undoubtedly spaces that Perriand helped design. Here we see the one for the Villa Stein at Garches, and she arrived just at the end of its design. And here the iconic image of the kitchen at Villa Savoie alongside the kitchen in Le Corbusier's own apartment. The caption in his volume of the Œuvre Complète under the kitchen at Villa Savoie read, "The kitchen is not exactly the sanctuary of the house, but is certainly one of the places one lives. Kitchen or living room, these are the places one dwells." By the early 1930s, male architects as diverse as Walter Gropius, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, Hugo Haring, and Rob Mallet-Stevens all designed kitchens. The kitchens that had been for so long ignored by architects as a place for servants or women too lowly for the architect's attention or the master's attention was now a part of architecture and a part that was celebrated. And in fact, this kitchen for a rather lavish villa by Mallet-Stevens was the most published photograph and drawing of the project itself. And I actually would propose that this interest in kitchens is something that is perpetuated to today, and perhaps maybe even grown as men are finally cooking. Although there were limits to how much rationalization could improve the daily lot of women, certainly it did not resolve the gender division of labor and women's double shift. The very recognition that household drudgery was oppressive to women and that domestic spaces required modernization undoubtedly encouraged a social climate that would lead later to further reform. Housing. Women's interest in the transformation of the domestic realm extended beyond furniture and the kitchen. Arenas that might be seen as almost natural extensions, in quotes, natural, of women's traditional role to housing at a larger scale. Perriand designed the residential units for Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse and Algiers plans. Lohotsky worked in both Vienna and Frankfurt on the design of numerous housing settlements. Here we see a proposal for single women studio apartments. Helena Sirkis, with her husband Sismund, was responsible for several of the most important modern housing complexes in Poland before World War II, including the Warsaw Housing Cooperative that you see here. And other women, lesser known, and whom I hope will be the subject of future research or future studies, were actively engaged in housing, often designing projects with innovative programs and collective amenities. Here, a remarkable complex in Vienna by Ella Briggs, and here, a home for unwed mothers in Helsinki by the Finnish architect Elna Kiljaner, who, by the way, also designed kitchens inspired by Schutt Lohotsky. However, not everyone concerned with housing and urban development was trained as a designer or architect. This was true of two of the leading housing reformers of the period, Catherine Bauer in the United States and Elizabeth Denby in England. As in the case of the women's movement for household rationalization, the Women's Campaign for Housing Reform after World War I had its roots in efforts dating back to the 19th century, especially in Britain and the US. And here I show you the remarkable Octavia Hill, who wrote a series of books calling for the transformation of slum conditions and was herself involved in the design of this arts and crafts project for impoverished residents. It's called the Red Cross Cottages in Southwark, London. In the US, Edith Elmer Wood played a similar role the first third of the 20th century, as did the younger Catherine Bauer, a fervent modernist who was commonly known as a houser. She advised labor unions to build their own housing with better units and more amenities, daycare facilities, laundries, community centers, and even swimming pools, as is the case in the Carl Mackley Housing Project, where Bauer served as a consultant for the American Hosiery Federation of Workers, and she worked closely with the architect Oscar Stoneroff to accommodate their needs and wishes. Since Bauer's career has received considerable scholarly attention, I shall focus today instead on Elizabeth Denby's remarkable efforts to improve housing, which are almost unknown outside of England. A writer, political advocate, and designer, Denby had an important role in alerting modern British architects to the social dimensions of housing between the wars. Architect and her collaborator, Maxwell Fry, called her the finest, quote, domestic architect I ever knew. Like many women who became active in housing issues in England since the late 19th century, Denby's involvement with design grew out of her experience helping to ameliorate the lives of the poor. For 10 years, she worked as an administrator of a voluntary organization, the Kensington Council of Social Services, where she also directed the Housing Trust. However, she was frustrated with the paternalism and lack of professionalism of so many charity efforts, and in 1933, she decided to embark on a new career, one she basically invented as an independent housing consultant, in which, again, kitchens were a major subject of concern. She even gave a radio broadcast on BBC Radio talking about the need to rationalize kitchens and pay attention to the needs of housewives. In 1933, the same year, she met Maxwell Fry, who had recently become a passionate proponent of modern architecture, and they began to collaborate on two seminal housing projects for low-income residents, Sassoon House and Kensil House. Although Sassoon House was the first modernist working-class housing project in England and was widely praised for its spacious, well-planned units, Kensil House gave Denby and Fry an opportunity to realize their social vision more fully. Denby seems to have been largely responsible for the programming and overall concept, Fry for the building structure and architectural form. Sponsored by the Gas, Light, and Coke Company, Kensil House was intended to demonstrate the benefits of gas as a superior and low-cost source of fuel. However, Denby and Fry soon persuaded the company directors to create a new kind of housing that would allow, quote, people whose incomes allow them little above sheer necessity to experience as full a life as can be, unquote. In particular, they sought to create a vibrant social community, what Denby called an urban village, a term she used before Hillary Clinton. They tackled these goals in two ways: through the creation of efficient, comfortable units intended to minimize the burdens of housework, and through the inclusion of collective amenities, which they hoped would foster social connections and a sense of public participation. Working closely with Fry, Denby brought to the design of the housing units an attention to functional details, especially concerning women's needs, that was rare even in the most advanced modernist housing complexes. Among the innovative features in each apartment were the gaslit Coke stove and the built-in radio speaker in the living room. Here you see a unit of the, go back please, a unit of the period with the built-in speaker on the upper right. And in the kitchen, we have modern gas appliances, including an instantaneous hot water heater, an Ascot heater, and washing copper, a large pot where sheets or diapers could be boiled, and a recessed balcony intended for drying laundry, eliminating the burden of carrying wet laundry to the roof. Off the living room was a second balcony, large enough to fit a table and for children to play in. Ground level storage for baby carriages and bicycles at the base of the stairwells spared mothers the labor of lugging prams up flights of stairs, as was typical in tenement housing. Above all, Denby sought to create comfortable, affordable residences that would relieve some of the drudgery in women's lives. She was confident that household rationalization would, quote, free the individual to take part in other sides of life, the life of the mind and the spirit, and in particular that the application of scientific techniques to the private realm would allow women more opportunities for participation in the public realm. Thus, providing collective amenities was of special importance to her, and the project included an array of them: a nursery school with play terrace and wading pool, clubs for teenagers and adults with a sewing room for women and a workshop for men, allotment and leisure gardens, and a sports area. Denby hoped that the well-equipped nursery school would cut off, quote, the slum tradition at the root. Denby had been highly critical of the physical and social isolation of most low-income housing projects and believed that the fostering of community in such housing would lead to a greater sense of community at large. By all accounts, Kensil House was a successful endeavor. Rent and utility fees were low, and according to contemporary testimonies, tenants were largely pleased with their new surroundings. In a 1942 survey, one resident comparing Kensil House to her former slum quarters remarked, "We thought this was heaven." The project was widely praised in the popular and professional press, and almost immediately upon completion was featured in the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition, Modern Architecture in England. It was also featured as British propaganda during World War II as a model of why the Brits should fight for it now, an example of a well-planned dwelling with light and air. By the time Kensil House was inaugurated in 1937, Denby's ideas about habitation had evolved further. She remained firmly committed to urban life, but was skeptical of large, high-rise apartment blocks, even those with the amenities of Kensil House, as a solution for low-income families. Most working-class people, she maintained, still dreamed of a cottage with a garden, though not at the cost of social isolation. Denby now proposed mixed urban developments, apartments for single people and childless couples, and low-rise, high-density housing for families that would be near schools, community centers, and collective amenities. And it was always the social that she was stressing in her housing work. In 1939, she proposed these ideas in a new project at the Daily Mail Ideal Home exhibition in London, the All Europe House. The project, which she designed by herself, synthesized her knowledge of British working-class life with the lessons she had learned from a year-long study trip in Europe, hence the name All Europe. Again, by keeping costs and labor to a minimum, Denby sought to create housing that would improve women's lives. The exhibition catalog proclaimed it a house that is a woman's house book come true. Like the Kensil House, it was widely praised by the press. Inspired by Georgian examples, Denby proposed a complex of stepped or echeloned, we used to say in architecture school, terraces. The two-story, flat-roofed, bricked houses had minimal front yards, with only a paved terrace and flower boxes, resulting, as one critic noted, in a pleasantly urban and humane street. The backyards, in contrast, were generous, including a private triangular terrace shielded from the neighbor's view, and a garden large enough for flowers and a few vegetables, which opened onto an extensively planted common garden. She placed the kitchen at the front of the house, where mothers might keep an eye on the street, and the living room at the back so it could overlook the garden. The house was furnished by a committee of women, and not necessarily professionals. Denby did the living room, others did the other rooms. And once more, the goal was to create a pleasant atmosphere that would appeal to the working class residents using well-built, inexpensive furnishings. Not necessarily high design, but furnishings that people would like. Denby's efforts also suggest a realism about costs and an understanding of popular taste that was rare in the modern movement, certainly not apparent in the model apartment that Perriand designed for the 1929 Salon d'Automne. Denby was not alone in preferring low-rise to high-rise housing in the 1930s. But what was unusual was both her sensitivity to working class values and her insistence that modern housing maintain the diversity of urban life. The contributions of Perriand, Lahutsky, and Denby differ markedly in their formal character and social intentions, but each in their own way helped to recast architecture from a profession that was primarily devoted to monumental institutional architecture to one that was deeply engaged with domestic reform, housing, and social issues. They were not, of course, the only women to do so. Similar claims might be said about Ino Elto, Marta Blomstedt, Ella Briggs, Gina Overbook, Lot Cohen, Lily Reich, and Helena Sirkis, and Elsa Godoni, who did this project in Tel Aviv before she came to the US. All of these women, and again, I could give so many more names, had active careers doing large housing projects before World War II. This does not mean that modern architecture was free of the sexism and stereotypes so pervasive during that period. Architects were notorious for their sexist comments, and hierarchies persisted in artistic collaborations and office structures. The formal inventions, or what we might call the high culture of modern architecture, still remained primarily the province of men. However, some architectural historians and critics of the period, such as Gustav Adolf Platz and Karl Teiga, admired unequivocally the contributions of these pioneering women, rejecting the traditional emphasis in architecture on art, in fact, recasting what was art in their praise of these women. And Reich was a special favorite of Platz, as you can see in this homage to her here, an example of an exhibition apartment she designed. The focus on habitation, however, introduces further complications concerning women's status in the profession or society at large. It might be assumed that women only gained power in their traditional realm, the home, and that modern architecture thus reinforced the persistent division of gender-defined social spheres. But the attention and seriousness that the house and housing had in the modern movement for both male and female designers belies any reductive generalizations about limitations on women's opportunities in the profession or facile assumptions of victimhood. Indeed, one might assert the reverse, that women's leadership in this domain made men more aware of aspects of domestic and urban life that they had largely ignored up to that time, whether due to traditional aesthetic preoccupations or as a result of their new enthusiasm for standardization and industrial production. Women designers, critics, and advocates of domestic reform, like their male peers, helped undermine the long-standing hierarchy in architecture that elevated public buildings over private ones, institutional buildings over residential ones, and in the domestic sphere, spaces of display over service-oriented ones. In this respect, their efforts can be seen as extending the campaign of the domestic reform feminists at the beginning of the century to give the home greater stature as a place of labor and creativity, though now with a much greater awareness of urban conditions and working class residents. Denby articulated what Perriand and Lohutsky and most women involved in modern architecture must have sensed, that freedom in the domestic realm was integrally tied to women's participation as citizens and in the world at large. It was not a question of separating domestic and public life, but rather of integrating them. Modern architecture may have been largely male, but it was also deeply shaped and enhanced by these women designers' visions of living. Visions that sought to liberate both men and women from the constraints of outmoded traditions and to provide them with opportunities for richer, more joyous daily lives. Thank you so much.